Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Due to recording issues, there were drops in audio and video. We've done our best to edit these out, but where we couldn't, you will experience jumps in the conversation that may not necessarily make sense. We appreciate you listening and watching this episode, and we'll always try to improve our quality moving forward. Thank you. To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the BruteCast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the United States government. We will also be recording the webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have a question, just type it in the group chat and I'll get through them in the order received. Discontinuities cause disruption and can change the path of trends. They are unexpected and their interactions with complex environments are unpredictable and a cause of friction. Many of us have heard of black swans, a common metaphor for describing the disproportionate effect of previously unobserved, high-impact, hard-to-predict, and rare events. The phrase can trace its origins back to the 2nd century when black swans were assumed to not exist. It was still used commonly until the discovery of a black swan in the late 1600s, and then it took on the metaphor we use today. The outbreak of World War I and 9/11 are typical examples. Black jellyfish are issues that we think we know about and understand, but which turn out to be far more complex and uncertain. Steering back to World War I, the hardships placed on Germany gave rise to many of the factions in their country that would eventually allow for the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. Finally, black elephants are a cross between the two. Everyone knows about them, but no one wants to deal with them, the elephant in the room. I offer that as an explanation for our episode's title and a backdrop to the conversations we're going to have with our guests. I'd like to welcome Lisa McKinnon Mundy. She's a 2007 graduate from the United States Naval Academy and served as a Naval Intelligence Officer at sea with Naval Special Warfare and at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid. She holds a master's in Latin American Studies from Stanford, and she is a 2022-23 Hoover Institution Veteran Fellow, where her work focused on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. She is also the project lead for Project Maritime for the Irregular Warfare Initiative and a joint venture between West Point's Modern War Institute and the Empirical Studies of Conflict at Princeton University. She's a career civil servant, currently serving as the Director of Plans, Doctrine, and Studies in 51 at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. Today, however, she's speaking to us in her capacity as a Hoover Veteran Fellow. Joining us is Dr. Sal Mercogliano. He graduated from SUNY Maritime College before becoming a merchant marine, then earning his master's from East Carolina in maritime history and nautical archaeology, followed by his PhD in military and naval history from the University of Alabama. He is the chair for the History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science Department at Campbell University, as well as an adjunct professor of history and engineering at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. He is a frequent contributor to the G-Captain website, as well with Proceedings. His YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping, examines the global maritime industry and will be linked in the show notes for those listening in the future and dropped in the chat for those joining us live.
Opening of the conversation about strategic competition, all of these different things started to connect. I found Sal's channel, I read Ian Urbina's book, like all these different things about the maritime environment that we weren't thinking about started to make sense for me. And I wanted to share that with other folks to kind of cross-pollinate and get people curious about these topics and to do so in order to buy down that risk of those discontinuities that we talked about. If we can be curious and we can cast a wider net when we think about the environment, how much more informed will our decisions and decision makers and policymakers be? So that's sort of my angle. And I'm just really glad that Sal could join us. And thanks again for the invitation and warm welcome to everybody to join the dialogue for Project Maritime. We're trying to be very collaborative. We accept submissions. We want to collaborate and we want to get the word out and share and talk about these important themes. So thank you.
I want to thank Lisa for inviting me on and the Krulak Center for having me on. General Krulak has been an amazing person to watch, and Emily, I actually met General Krulak out in Pacific one time, so it was a great moment. So I enjoyed that, and Brute Krulak, of course, is a legend on that. I'll add just on to Lisa, one of the things I try to do is get the navalists interested in non-navalist issues, particularly maritime issues. I think we focus a lot, and we do it a lot in the United States, on maritime naval aspects, but we avoid the maritime aspect. So there was a great talk just done by Dr. Andrew Lambert, where he talked about sea power versus sea power being the one word versus sea power being the two word. And that one word is kind of that naval aspect. It's the projection of force. It is the military application of sea power ashore, which we get very comfortable and very good at doing. But the other element is that soft power. It's that commercial power. It is that element of what is the private sector doing, and why is maritime trade so essential? I think we were talking about this just a minute ago, a very good application of that, in that we had to extradite Americans out of Israel. How'd we do that? We chartered a cruise ship, and we went to Royal Caribbean Lines. We got a cruise ship, and we were able to sail them from Haifa up to Cyprus in a very benign environment, but well-protected environment under the umbrella of the Israeli military, and then shifted it over to the U.S. military to get them out. I think one of the things that has come to light, especially when we're talking about black swan events, was the number of black swan events we had during 2020 and onward with the supply chain crisis. I can't tell you the number of times I went on podcasts and TV shows and news shows, and we were talking about the next black swan event, when they're not supposed to be happening like that. There's not supposed to be a flock of black swans, but we seem to be getting hit by them all the time. And I think one of the aspects is, how did that impact the military, and particularly my early studies was on military naval logistics. And one of the things that becomes very clear is how much commercial logistics is very similar to military naval logistics. And in many ways, when one suffers, the other one will suffer also. So that's my aspect of coming to it. And that's one of the reasons why I like to look at the broad scope of shipping.
So for the Marine Corps specifically, we've been so hyper-focused for the vast majority of our history looking from the land inward. And then as we've pivoted towards the Pacific, we've started having a lot more conversations about first island chain, second island chain, looking at, the Marine Corps actually conducting sea control or sea denial. So playing more into what I think, the two words of sea power that you were describing, Dr. Ricagliano. And then from a naval aspect, though, like, there's a lot going on that I don't think we're super focused on. When we talk about sea control, sea denial, we're looking at it from a, how do I deny combat ships? How do I deny, ISR platforms? But we haven't really, at least I haven't heard the conversation about, everybody else. So a few weeks ago, we had Dr. Barabee on, and we were talking about maritime NGOs. And we had a big discussion about the whale wars and that organization. So what elements do you think, from your standpoint, where should the Marine Corps kind of be focusing our energy and thinking about, how we want to play into sea power, sea control, sea denial, that maybe we as Marines have not thought about? Lisa, you've got a Navy background, and in theory, so do I, but you have a very different Navy background than I do. Are they thinking about it in the Navy the same way?
Well, I'll say that part of Project Maritime, we're focused on sort of 3 lines of effort. And so I'll kind of answer the question based on that framework. So the first thing is, we're exploring current events and their underlying historical and geographical precedents. And then we're looking at number 2 is the big changes happening in policy and doctrine. So there's big changes afoot in the Department of the Navy, with changes to Title X roles to include peacetime roles. And then also just this reemergence of thinking in a maritime fashion. And I'll give you an example of one of the pieces. I don't know if you can share the slides. I wasn't able to, but Walker Mills has written 2 pieces for our project, because I don't know that Walker Mills ever sleeps, because he just is incredible. But the title of one, I think, is telling to kind of get at your question. it's more than wet gap crossings. Riverine capabilities are needed for irregular warfare and beyond. And that more than wet gap crossings kind of gets at that, thinking about the maritime space and the maritime dimension as maneuver space and not just benign waters to pass through to get to an offshore location to support ground operations. And that's sort of the big paradigm shift that we're seeing. And we haven't paid attention to the maritime dimension, and Walker's written a lot on it. And that's why it's just an exciting time. And that's why incorporating people like Sal or G Captain and opening sort of the places you're getting information from, it's so critical. And we wanted to come on and really talk about that, of thinking about commodity prices. What can we learn from commodity prices? What can we learn from watching the marine insurance markets, the new environmental regulations, and how will those impact that maneuver space and the whole dimension?
Yeah, and I think, Sir, over to you as well. I think, you've got a very different background as well, approaching, the maritime environment in general. So, what aspects of, civil maritime should we be focusing on as well?
Well, right off the bat, I would say, just look at what's in the news right now with the severing of cables between Scandinavia and the Baltic countries. 1914, the Royal Mail Service of United Kingdom goes out in the English Channel and fishes up 3 German cables and saws them in half and severs off the German ability to communicate with their overseas cruisers by cutting the cables to their radio stations in Africa. This is the type of element that we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about the surface, but also the subsurface. We've talked about this. You've seen this come out now with what a blockade of Taiwan would look like. And it may not be the traditional blockade. It may be a Chinese ship going around the island, scooping up and sawing cables in half and severing off the communication element from them. The sea is not a flat playing field. I see a lot of war games that want to look at this. And I love a lot of these games that have come out and these kind of war games, but the sea is a lot different than the air environment. When you look at Ukraine, you vacate the airspace over Ukraine. You will not vacate the Taiwan Strait or the Eastern Pacific of targets and ships. And how do you go through those vessels to identify? It's great to have that scenario where you're sitting on an atoll and you can fire that missile and knock out a surface target. But the problem is, what happens when there's 100 fishing boats between you and them? Who is the right player here? When you initiate a blockade or an economic sanction against anyone, what does that entail? How do you deal with the Panamanian registered vessel that is owned by a Japanese company that's registered, or it's part of a German company? What play does that have? And this is where the maritime environment becomes so much more complex than what we think it is when it comes into the modern commercial environment, because there's so many elements. And unfortunately, most times the military is focusing on a very straightforward problems. It's military on military. You're focusing on that. But unfortunately, on ocean, there are so many different players out there that you have to deal with. We're seeing it right now with the Chinese, the PLAN, but you also have the Chinese Coast Guard, you have the maritime militia, you have their fishing fleets. We're seeing corporate entities on the oceans waging foreign policy. Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, self-sanctioned Russia. They exercised a political policy. They decided not to trade with Russia anymore because of the invasion of Ukraine. That means that we have corporations who are having policies out there. Are we talking to those companies? Back in the height of the Cold War, we thought for a long time, well, NATO ships and NATO countries, they will be on our side. We will get those fleets. We will have them to count on. That's not the case anymore. You may have a headquarters in Denmark, in Copenhagen, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get that vessel to be used in time of war. And so the maritime element is multidimensional. And I think we need to be spending more time understanding how that trade operates, how the business operates, and what we could expect to see on a battlefield that's going to happen in a very short period of time in a very convoluted environment. How do you decipher who's the bad guys, who are the good guys? In very much ways, it almost becomes what Lisa talks about there is this irregular warfare. It's asymmetric. It is almost a counterinsurgency of trying to figure out who is the bad guy, who is the person that you're trying to get.
Yeah, because there are systems that do, publish positions. There are websites where you can track, hey, my stuff is on this ship and it's going from this location to this location. You can see a general idea of where they are on the sea. But I mean, it's similar to aircraft and, putting out their mode 3 codes, giving altitude and position. But if I turn that off in my aircraft, I'm no longer putting that out, and I need some other method to, find where I am. Um,
And we see that regularly spoofed all the time with we're seeing, as a matter of fact, one of the things that we're seeing because of Russia Ukraine is a growth in what is referred to as the dark fleet. These are vessels that are involved in illicit trade. Initially we saw it with Venezuelan oil and Iranian oil, but now we see more and more ships doing that. And this means that ships are moving cargo, they're doing ship to ship transfers out in illegal spots. And unfortunately, the International Maritime Organization, which is the UN's shipping arm, doesn't require you to squawk AIS like an aircraft does. So you can turn it off, you can spoof it. We've seen it done all the time. And it's not unusual for ships to be showing themselves in the Med when they're actually off the coast of South Africa, for example.
Just a little plug. I have a Georgetown intern who's brilliant. Umar is on the call, and he's working on a piece just about this topic, about AIS spoofing for the project. And I'm eager to share that. And maybe when we get to Q&A, he can share a little bit about his work and his findings. But certainly very dynamic. And I think that's the third line of effort for Project Maritime, is to look at emerging technologies and to see sort of that impact. Especially, we kind of latched on to Blue OSINT. So the idea that you can see things that you couldn't have seen with new technologies, new algorithms, and the implications for small states especially. So in the old days, you'd have to actually patrol your waters. And now we can queue and we can see things in a different way. So you can have economies of scale to a certain extent and help with that enforcement and EEZs. And so that's a new trend and something to, and the transparency is just sort of something new.
Yeah, I would argue too on the tanker side, for example, there are outfits like Tanker Trackers, which is, basically emerged. They have satellite imaged 4,000 tankers around the world, so that, if you're buying a load of crude oil, you can hire them to track that tanker for you. They're not relying on AIS. They're using web cameras. They're using open source intelligent satellites so that they know what the topside image of a tanker looks like, and they'll catch it and make sure it's where it's supposed to be. And so again, this is that element, because AIS can be used to hide a ship. It can also be used to all of a sudden put 100 ships someplace you don't expect them to be. And again, when you get reliant on it, we're seeing a lot of nations around the world. I know Lisa can talk about this from the fishing aspect. You'll have a fleet of 200 vessels outside your EEZ fishing, but some of them are turning off their AIS, coming inside the EEZ, harvesting fish, scooping them up, and then going back out. And unless you have visual patrolling, unless you have sources on site to put eyeballs on them, a lot's being done that we don't see. And it's just because the ocean is really busy out there in terms of, there's more ships sailing today than ever before, and it's becoming more and more congested.
Yeah, I was looking at the, recently we had Drake Long, one of our non-resident fellows, come on, and we talked about seabed disputes. And we kind of touched on it a little bit, but we didn't go super into it. But the illegal fishing aspect of it. Lisa, could you talk a little bit about that and why that's an important thing to track and pay attention to?
Illegal fishing in general,
Yeah.
sure. So my work focuses mostly on the illegal fishing of these distant water fishing fleets. So there's plenty of illegal fishing that happens in Asia, and I'm focused mostly on the Latin American cases. So big issue in 2020 off the Galapagos, and I think I'm so encouraged by the fact that when I say that, most folks shake their head like they knew about that already. Um, so that's good. That means that we're communicating about these issues and people are getting interested. Also Argentina, huge problem. And maybe if you can put the slides up, I'd like to show that cover from the New Yorker article from Ian Urbina this week. He talks about the distant water fleets. So not only is it an ocean governance problem, not only are you denying small states the artisanal fishing industries, there's also a really intense forced labor aspect to this issue. So for me, the illegal fishing issue writ large is a really good lens or case study for contextualizing strategic competition. When we first started talking about strategic competition as a country, maybe in 2018, it was hard to kind of peg what that meant. It was a little amorphous, a little esoteric. So I kind of globbed onto illegal fishing to kind of show the challenges, but also the opportunities. So for example, during that summertime when all the Chinese distant water fishing vessels were off the Galapagos, we did a couple things right in terms of campaigning. First of all, we allowed Ecuador to be in the lead and the regional partnerships to be in the lead on most aspects of it. But the second thing, we really did an IO thing right too, because we had astronaut Chris Cassidy happened to be past the imagery of passing over, showed the Galapagos, didn't mention the event, but just said, this is one of the precious places on Earth. And it resonated with folks in a way. So sometimes we get bogged down talking about challenges, but I wanted to make sure that part of the project, we also talk about opportunities. We don't have a prevent defense mindset of just sort of countering. And we think about, well, what do people care about? Well, people care about their regional livelihoods. They care about fish is a commodity. It's tied to basic Pavlovian needs. And kind of just contextualizing all of that and then adding in the forced labor aspect and thinking that through too, of why this is problematic from a number of different lenses. And so if you can pull, it's maybe 1 or 2 slides in, and I cannot recommend his work enough. We have a Q&A coming out with him as well. It's Ian Urbina, and he has a fantastic book called Outlaw Ocean. Must read if you're interested in maritime things, or even if you're not, you will be by the end, because he's telling it from a different lens. So sometimes I think we can be a little stodgy in naval circles and it can be boring. But he really is brilliant at putting the human dimension into the story and explaining Sea Shepherd's operations. He'll talk about a really interesting tactic that a woman in Europe uses to bring ships just outside territorial waters for activism and abortion, to bring attention to that issue. So he really looks at things that I don't think we normally would be looking at in DoD or navalist circles. So can't recommend that book enough. And then he just had a big expose published in the New Yorker this week about illegal fishing and the labor abuses and the personal story of some of the mariners. And it's really moving. So I would just highly recommend everybody take a look. And he has a mini series too of his shorts that are based on his book that you can check out at Outlaw Ocean Project.
I think one of the questions I have, just thinking to like a Title 10 type thing, with law enforcement, what can the Navy and the Marine Corps do about something like illegal fishing? Or, Dr. McConaughey, you mentioned, folks pulling up cables and cutting them. So what is it that, that we could do as a service to even start thinking about to be able to help with that situation, if we even can?
Well, I think one of the big things is monitoring and surveying, is the fact that the Marines and the Navy are so forward presence that they are out there seeing things, and being able to report that. We have the Coast Guard for that. And we've been pushing the Coast Guard further and further out as our law enforcement. We've just signed a series of treaties to help certain island nations in the Pacific enforce their EEZs, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia. It's a big swath of ocean out there to patrol. And, some of it creates some dissent with us and China, for example. We forget how much protein China needs, and they count on from the ocean. It is a huge element that they have. And understand that there's issues with this dating back 2 centuries, where we have an EEZ in the Pacific largely because of something called the Guano Act of 1856, where we were hunting bird poop on islands, and we claimed Howland and Baker Island. And so it creates this tension between the rivalry we see happening. So I think for the Marines and for the Navy in particularly, is really that surveillance, is observation and seeing what is going on and having an understanding of what fishing fleets are and why they're so crucial and strategic to a nation, that fishing fleet, and it's not just the fishing fleet, it's the processing vessels. It is all those elements that bring that fish back, because the fishing fleet doesn't come back. They don't load up with fish and come home. That's not what they're doing. They're out there for months and months at a time. They're kind of like the old-fashioned whaling ships that went out for a year or two, and they'd be gone and come back. And it's also where you see the worst trepidations done to seafarers. We fixed that in our industry, but unfortunately it is undone in other areas. And reporting on that is another element, because that's IMO, that's International Maritime Labor Relations. I think one of the biggest things that the Navy and Marine Corps should be advocating for is the passage of UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which will allow us to, take China to court on some of these issues when we see them being done. It doesn't help that China ratifies UNCLOS and doesn't follow it, and we don't ratify it and we follow it. So it would give us a little bit more of I think, a power to make those arguments. But I think the visualization is really the biggest thing, is making sure we understand what we're seeing out there on the ocean. Unfortunately, for a lot of people in the Navy, these are just targets on the radar that I got to get past and not run into. We got to, contextualize of what that fishing fleet means, and why am I seeing 300 ships shifting, across my bow, heading to a new area, and they're not on my AIS. That's a problem. They're going into someone's EEZ to fish that area, and we need to let somebody know about that to make sure we don't do it. Because understand, I was talking to someone from Sixth Fleet not too long ago, and we're talking about that a lot of what this does is anti-piracy, because what happened in Somalia, for example, is they got overfished. They lost their ability. The mariners lost their ability, and they adopted piracy in the 2010s. And so in many ways, safety and reporting prevents an anti-piracy campaign later on, or illegal trade.
Just to piggyback too, we want to focus on the maritime dimension, but the building the capacity and the governance structures ashore are the other piece of the puzzle. You can do all these things at sea, but if you can't collect evidence or action it on a governance side, so that's where it rolls back into this whole of nation and whole of government, building partner capacity, all these things that we talk about. But when you apply it to, say, illegal fishing or another case study, you can really start to see how they all impact. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago at NDU on IUU fishing. We had labor there. We had state there. We had people that you wouldn't have seen in a room talking about these issues a few years ago. So it's just really encouraging that we're looking for these partnerships, and NOAA, fisheries, things like that, people that wouldn't have had occasion to talk, and now they're talking and they're looking for these opportunities.
And if you build that on with what China's been doing with Belt and Road and their elements they're getting into, they're getting footholds all around the world. And again, it's not we're not talking about a huge, massive presence here to really fight this. You can take a spearhead EPF, you can put a platoon of Marines on board, you can put a Coast Guard leadette on board, you can put some drones on board, and you all of a sudden now provide a capability to a nation that can't monitor a huge, vast area. But this is a surveillance operation. All you're doing is surveillance and relaying information. So much like you would do on an island chain or somewhere forward deployed, you're doing the same thing. You're cataloging vessels, you're recording them, providing them the data uplink so that they can go out and do the enforcement elements and operations for you. And again, we have those resources and tools. We just need to get out there. And more importantly, it puts us on a good setting with these nations, showing a presence. Whereas right now, many places, the only place you see a presence is Chinese money.
Yeah, to bring it back to the title, the piracy off of Somalia, I didn't realize that there was a correlation back to overfishing and a lack of fishing, kind of forcing folks to go in and do that. When Lisa brought up the idea of the black jellyfish, black elephant before, like I had never, not a concept that I had heard, but I find it, fascinating. And then listening to that.
It was also marine pollution, because a lot of ships were sailing down the Red Sea. They couldn't do dumping of their waste, and they would get off the coast of Somalia and then just dump. And so you had fishing, you had environmental damage being done. And again, this is something that can be reported and something that needs to be observed. One of the things we do have is a presence out there where we can see these things.
And document for, like, we've had some successes with like Panama deflagging vessels that have been involved in nefarious activities. So yeah, predicting, seeing in real time, and then also documenting to be able to take legal action.
And that was one of the things that Dr. Barabee had talked about with Sea Shepherd before was, they kind of shifted from being a more aggressive to not necessarily as aggressive, but using information and, data tracking as kind of a weapon almost in order to, meet the same intent without being labeled, I think at one point they were not necessarily labeled a terrorist organization, but, not seen in a good light until later on when they changed up kind of their tactics.
And that's also why the Coast Guard, besides all the other reasons why they're really playing an outsized role in today's environment, but they do have those law enforcement authorities and they understand evidence collection and things like that. So really great partners.
And sir, you had brought up the point about using law against countries like the PRC who ratified UNCLOS but don't follow it. Albert Lee asks, officially ratifying it would be helpful for lawfare. We've actually had a previous guest. My first episode of BruteCast was with Dr. Joanna Sakara, and she had talked about Chinese effects in Europe and how they needed to combat it. And she talked about using lawfare as opposed to warfare in order to do that. So Albert's question was, how effective can the approach be? Even if we did ratify UNCLOS, we follow it anyway. But if China's not going to follow it, who really cares if they've ratified it? So how much effect could that have?
Well, I think it has a big effect. I really do, because we operate, one of the things we want to do is go away from what Ian talks about as the outlaw sea and put it under law. I mean, that's one of the things that should be our goal, is to get away from the lawless sea and start creating structure upon it. And, by citing this, by bringing cases and doing the legal aspect, you make the argument that you can't get away with it. This is what you do. It's kind of the broken window, analogy the police departments do. The way you start cleaning up a neighborhood is you fix every broken window, and you start doing that. And you got to start doing that on the sea. If China sees they can get away with it, they're going to get away with it. No, it's not just China, it's every other country in the world. We see that in the commercial industry. If you can get away with illegal dumping in an area, other ships will illegally dump. We're seeing right now, Australia, for example, is being really hard on the inspection of vessels coming into their ports. They are not just physically inspecting the vessels, but ensuring that the crews are well maintained. They're getting paid. They're doing all this stuff. And, that's part of port state control we have, where under the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, doesn't matter what flag you fly, you have to meet these certain requirements and these parameters. And so I think it is in our best interest to sit there and say, we follow the law, we're going to make others follow the law, because then China cannot get away and other nations can't get away with kind of bluntly refusing to do it. I mean, again, look at what we've done. We've made some substantial changes in ocean shipping over the past 20 years. There are fewer ships today than ever before that are being lost. Loss of lives, loss of ships, insurance claims, fire, you name it, is much better than it has been in the past. And that's because of a lot of getting on vessels to make sure they're following the rules and regulations. We cleaned up flags. The Liberian flag used to be the joke of the worst flag out there. Everyone went to Liberia because there was very few rules and registry. It's the biggest flag again today. And because there's a lot was done to help clean up the registry and get it under certain control. So I think, again, when you want to make a case, you've got to be able to sit there and say, not only are you following the rules, but we're making them follow the rules too. And that's why I think it's really important for us to ratify UNCLOS, because then we can't sit there and say, well, we're not a member, but we follow it.
I want to, so one of the deep dives that you have at Project Maritime is maritime geography. So, one of the ideas that we have is, key terrain, and being able to, we're using that same term, but we're using it for the ocean. So, we've got some key straits all over the world, the ones that immediately come to mind: Straits of Malacca, Bab el-Madrid, Straits of Hormuz, some of these straits, Straits of Gibraltar. how important, because we talked about the ocean isn't flat. We can go kind of all over the place, but we've got different terrain. So a lot of when the Suez Canal got blocked, they were talking millions of dollars a day while that ship sat in the Suez Canal. How easy is it, or how hard is it for shipping to, reroute, essentially, to avoid some of these areas if they do get blocked?
Okay, well, this is a whole semester of discussion right here, but I just want to say a couple brief things, but this is really a place where Sal has a lot of insights, and I hope he'll tell the story. So he has what's going on with shipping. He has 140,000 subscribers, 2 million views. But I think the thing that's interesting about it is, of course, he's engaging and he's telling these stories, but it started with that incident and people were curious and people wanted to know more, and he was telling the story, and then it picks up steam. But I want him to tell a little bit about that journey, because I think it's interesting and it shows that there's a need for these dialogues, because you couldn't build a channel like that if there wasn't genuine interest and a need to have these conversations. But I mean, it's all I'm working on an article, and I'm going to call it it's the geography stupid, it's the economy stupid, just so important. So Project Maritime, a couple of us went down to the Panama Canal over the summer, and Sal was gracious enough to give us a pre-sale brief and talk about the history and some of the current events with the drought and all the different factors. And I would highly recommend, if you're looking for a summer vacation that's somewhere pretty close to the US, maybe one flight, maybe one connection away, um, largely a lot of English speakers, easy to access. Go to Panama. Go check out the Panama Canal. Do a partial transit. You can go on one of these Harbor Queen type boats, and you'll be behind a big vessel. They'll pair you and you'll go through. And I thought I knew how complex the operation was, but I'm only beginning to understand it. So also, though, thinking about, I'll just use the Panama Canal. We could talk about any strait. The Panama Canal is unique because nowhere else in the world is there a choke point that so disproportionately affects the United States. It's unbelievable the kind of things that we rely on the Panama Canal for. Oil from the Gulf Coast. I mean, incredible. And so my husband gave me a hard time. I just updated my bio and I put my hobbies, and I was like, I like to play pickleball and I collect rare and antique maps. And he thought that was a little nerdy, but I just bought a map that showed a projection of the Lake Nicaragua Canal, because we were thinking about how to solve this problem back in the early 1900s, and that was one of the COAs out there. So I guess I just can't. I'll go on and on about geography, so I'm going to cut myself off. But I think that that's really what's key to this project and what we need to understand, not just maritime geography in terms of like ports and choke points, but also the bathymetry. Okay, where is undersea warfare effective? Where are the cables? How deep are they? And I'm not sure that that's something that we really focus on enough. There's a Mark Twain quote. It says, God created war so that Americans would learn geography. And there's something to it. At the Arctic, those shipping, like there's a reason people are interested in transiting the Arctic, and that those shipping lanes are important, and the time you save, and it's all about saving like time and money and the transits. So keeping that shipping and business thoughts in the back of your head as you're thinking about the geography. Why are people fighting? What the Black Sea? Why is this important? Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Sal, and I hope you'll tell us a little bit about just the starting of your channel and just how it exploded because people were interested.
Well, as you said, it all started with Ever Given going sideways in the Suez Canal. I was writing for G Captain, and I got a call from the editor of G Captain saying the BBC wanted somebody to talk about this ship that's stuck in the Suez, and went on, talked about it. And then my buddy John Conrad over at G Captain and I decided to do a video, which was a little longer on it. And lo and behold, 2.5 years later, 140,000 subscribers and 20 million views. So it's a crazy environment, because I do find that people are really interested in it. It is something that was brought to the forefront right there. But to go back to the original question, a couple of things. Number one, how easy is it to divert? Well, that's hard left, hard right rudder, and you divert. That's the thing that's really unique about it, is that even when the Suez Canal closed for 6 days in 2021, remember, it had been closed for 8 years, from 67 to 73. It was closed for a year in 56. And we got around it. The problem is, what are the impacts of that going around it? Now, there's certain seas you can't get around: the Black Sea, the Straits of the Persian Gulf. Those are areas you can't bypass around. But I will say this about maps: get rid of your flat maps and everyone go buy a globe, because the world is not flat, no matter what my son's 8th grade teacher told him. It's not flat. It is round. Get Google Earth and take a look at it, because then you start seeing things. When you take that image of China on Google Earth and flip it so that the east is north or the east is up and the mainland of China is out, you begin to understand China a lot better when you see their entire access to the sea is Korea, Russia, Japan, the US and Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines. You understand how they feel about it. When you look at the Pacific and you understand that one of the great unknown choke points to anyone is the Aleutian Islands, because most ships coming from the east from the west, from the Western Pacific to the Eastern Pacific have to go north of Attu into the Bering Sea and down around Dutch Harbor, which makes ADAC the perfect place for a base, because it covers not just that great route trail, that great circle sailing, but it also gives you access to what China and Russia is doing right now, is sailing ships on the Northern Sea Route. We just saw the first non-ice strengthened ship come through that route and deliver goods from Shanghai to Kaliningrad, for example. It's also a ship that's in the news right now because of the cable cutting. It was right there at that area at the time. So, to me, the geography is really essential. It's really important. People don't understand where they live on the planet and how the geography plays a role. The Black Sea is a perfect example of that. Why is the Black Sea so important? I'll make the fundamental argument that Russia invades Ukraine not so much to grab the Donbass region, but it's to grab the northern shore of the Sea of Azov, that stretch of land between the Crimean Peninsula and their territory, not because they want the overland bridge to Crimea. They don't care about that. What they cared about was the Ukrainians in Mariupol and in that region could cut their supply line, their trade route, out of Rostov, which is the Don River, which is the Mississippi of Russia. It goes to an amazing inland waterway system that connects the Caspian, the Volga, the Don, all the way to the White Sea, the Baltic, the Moscow Canal. And if Ukraine controlled Mariupol, they could sever Russian trade in an instant, and it had to be grabbed. And that was one of the reasons they were willing to seize that territory. One of the reasons why the Russians allowed Ukraine to do the Black Sea Grain Initiative, because as long as they were getting their stuff out, that's all that mattered to them. So I would argue understanding the geography of ocean shipping, understanding the geography of the world, is really essential. When you look at China and understand China is a one coast nation and they're looking to the outlet that they have, you begin to understand, because whenever I hear people tell me that China is not a maritime nation, it's not a seafaring nation, it doesn't have a tradition about that, go back to Zheng He, go back to the 13th, 14th century, and you understand that China's rivers all flow into the ocean. That's where China's looking all the time.
And I think that understanding the geography part, for as a Marine, looking at it from a land piece, I can look at a chunk of terrain and just be like, okay, that hill's important, that valley is important, these roads, I need to make sure I keep these roads open. And I feel like, it's so ingrained in us that we're able to pick that up. But I've already heard some talk, the shipping lanes, the Great Circle routes. Lisa, you mentioned bathymetry. I think there's elements here that we as Marines aren't necessarily thinking about. I know for a short time, the Marine Corps was talking about how can we affect submarines as we look seaward, vice landward. And, my first question was, how do we even detect? That would be step one, I think. I can't kill a submarine that I can't find. So what other elements, I think some of them have been mentioned, but what are the elements that we need to focus on that maybe we're not thinking about because it's not traditional land-based geography thinking?
Well, if I zoom out macro, so professor I studied under at Stanford has a project about the origins of global prosperity. And I think it was a light on for me. Why do we know these cities? Rio de Janeiro, San Diego, New York, Boston, Shanghai. Like, why are all of sort of the global centers and cultural and financial hubs? They happen to be located with decent to good natural harbors that created ports that facilitated trade. So I think if we even zoom out like that big to like, why are these the critical cities around the globe? Why are most of the mega cities, why are they coastal and port cities? I think that's like a good place to start. And I know it sounds basic, but I don't know that that's necessarily well understood. So I would start there when I talk about like geography. And then I think we have a line of effort about novel environments. So looking and saying rivers. We don't talk nearly enough about rivers. We have our Mississippi River is one of the most fantastic rivers on the globe that facilitated a lot of trade. Same in Europe when we look at rivers. So I would say let's talk about the big picture of the geography. I'd say let's talk about features, like to your point about bathymetry. If you okay, you say I can't. How do I find the sub? Well, first, where would subs even be an effective form of combat? Okay, well, we got to look and see where can subs even operate undetected, and just thinking about that in a different way. Um, and then the last thing about geography is the concept of place and space and the parallels to cyberspace with the maritime space as a global commons, as well as outer space, and being able to see those linkages. I think that's another thing when you talk about geography. We want to talk about where things are, but also where they are sort of in terms of the global commons and where people think about the idea of the high seas.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, if you start thinking about how the Marines would operate on these, the first island, second island chain, one of the things I think is number one, don't be thinking about fighting submarines, but think about detecting craft. Period. I mean, it's that surveillance element too. One of the things that we are finding out is we need the nodes from which to launch surveillance platforms from to be able to get that imagery and that data and come back to it. One of my first sailing jobs I ever did was on a sonar surveillance vessel where we were basically a converted, fishing boat, it looked like. And we would just troll along with a passive sonar array and just, troll that around. Well, you don't need a crew of merchant mariners doing that anymore. All you need is to be able to launch that platform from an island, recover it, charge it back up, and send it back out again. And now all of a sudden you can provide that type of surveillance and uplink it and off you go. You're in the races at that point. This is what we're looking at and how things are going to be much different, especially when, fixed arrays could be damaged, could be targeted, they could be severed. And so you would have to come in with mobile arrays. You would have to come in with ways that you can surveil not just the ocean itself from satellites, from use of AIS technology and open source intelligence and classified methods, but also be able to project other ways out there. Back in the day when the Marines were looking at the Fleet Marine Force concept and they came up with the defense battalions, pre-World War II, one of the ideas was those would be little nodes from which they would be able to do reconnaissance and launch, host seaplane squadrons so that they'd be able to monitor and move strike squadrons around as they needed them. In many ways, we're returning back to that kind of philosophy again. But one of the things we're changing is how we collect the data and the intelligence. And I think that's really the big thing is you're going to be doing a lot more intelligence gathering because getting that picture and sifting through the picture is not going to be something that's done on the local level. It's going to be back done at a higher level because you're going to be able to look at the bigger picture because of how much data there is and how much vessels there are out there.
So we're quickly approaching our hour. I did want to ask one of the last questions I got presented is how do trends on Capitol Hill affect the ability of the Navy and Marine Corps to meet, we use the term at the opening, the black swans, jellyfish, and elephants, and so on. What do we need to see on Capitol Hill in order to better get to, where we need to be to better to do better in the maritime environment, for a lack of a better way to phrase that? Because I think both of you are looking at it some similar aspects, but I feel like from a different lens almost.
Yeah, I'll start first. I think one of the big things is we need the Congress and particularly the government to do more to build up our infrastructure, our maritime infrastructure. We've let it lag. I mean, one of the things that we've done is identified sea power as that military element and not the commercial side. So we became very reliant on our supply chain, on our maritime infrastructure, really being overseas and exported out. We've seen the decline of the U.S. Merchant Marine. We've seen the impact that has had in the shipbuilding and ship repair industry base here in the United States. I think the DoD should be the biggest advocate for restructuring, rebuilding a commercial infrastructure on that side. It's not that it will come out of their budget. It's not that they're paying for that. And it's not like we will become the #1 merchant marine on the planet. That's not going to happen. However, a rekindling of a national maritime industry, I think, would be very important. One of the things we see is the reason China, Japan, and Korea can be the #1 shipbuilders on the planet, building 93% of all the world ships, is because in the same shipyard that builds destroyers and submarines and aircraft carriers in China is container ships and tankers and LNG carriers. And so I think we need to improve that base. I think we need to continue that dialogue of understanding the commercial side. I think, especially for the Navy, which are out there on the high seas, again, most commercial ships to them are targets. That's what they wind up being. And we need to think of them as something more than just a ship I need to avoid or something I need to sink later on. It's something that we need to discuss the context of what it is. I've studied military sea lift command, which I sailed with for a long time, and I'm writing a history of it. And two of the most interesting commanders of that organization were submarine commanders from World War II, and Red Lawson Ramage and Glenn Donahoe. And one of the reasons they were so good at commanding commercial ships is because they sunk them, sitting down with the head of Maersk, and talking to them and seeing what they can do. It's not just a question of talking to Denmark and NATO. It's talking to these individual companies and what can we get from them? Man, you get a worldwide presence, Maersk. Can we tap into that for maybe something in the future that we can build on? That's something I think. Partner allianceships. The most common merchant mariners in the world today are Filipinos. We're renewing a dialogue with Philippines. What would happen if all of a sudden every Filipino mariner became, in a way, someone we can tap into for resources in the future? That's something we should be thinking about. Again, we need the government thinking about this. Unfortunately, we're stuck in a mire of trying to get any sort of legislation out because we've let it atrophy to the point where the Maritime Administration is really just trying to hang on to what it has. What we really need is a new maritime renaissance, I would argue. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Lisa, do you have anything?
Not much to add on sort of the policy and that whole scene, but I'll kind of point people, if you haven't already watched or listened to or read, the Secretary of the Navy had a great speech on Harvard campus about a month ago, talking about naval statecraft and it's encouraging. And for Project Maritime specifically, and I think this is something that's really special about the project, we've scoped it to talk about the where and the what. So, and not the who and the how. So we take that material school and kind of put it here. And we just want to know the facts. Where are the trends? Where are these choke points? And just kind of start there before we start worrying about assigning platforms and forces and thinking about it from that level.
Great. I'm going to throw it back to each of you for any closing comments that you might want to add, things you might want to plug before we close out for today. We'll close out for questions, but I just want to offer both of you an opportunity to get a little last piece in that maybe you didn't get a chance to talk about earlier and you feel is important, or again, plug anything that you're doing, because I think what you're both are doing is important, and I want to point people towards kind of those assets.
Yeah, I'll just say, one of the things I think that helps, anybody in the military right now, especially in the maritime environment, is to be informed of what's going on in the maritime sector. And I think one of the best things is there are a lot of sources out there you can tap into. G-Captain is one of my go-to sources. I think it's a really good encapsulation of what's big in the news sector. There are other ones out there that you can look at in transportation. But for me, I love to look at that one because I write for it, but I also think it gives you the most well-rounded. I think really understanding the maritime history that we have in this country beyond just the naval aspect, the commercial aspect. I love a book by Alex Rowland called Way of the Ship. It talks about the maritime history of the United States from 1600 to 2000. I think it's a great little encapsulation, really gives you the kind of historical context about it. And I'll give you my own plug, of course, for my YouTube channel, which is What's Going On with Shipping. Subscribe and like.
Thank you, sir. Lisa?
Yeah. Kiwi, if you can pull up the slides, I had a couple of other resources I wanted to showcase that I think people might be interested in if they're hungry for more. But the only other topic that I wanted to make sure we covered, we kind of went through all the deep dives in some way, but human security at sea, we talked about forced labor, but I wanted to highlight an article that Sal had written for the New York Times about the Titan case over the summer, and then to highlight that same week, there were 300 migrants lost at sea in the Mediterranean. So I also wanted to kind of highlight that refugee aspect and that the way the maritime space, especially in the Med, plays into greater migration crises and enforcement, and it's just complicated. So I wanted to make sure I recognized sort of that loss. And people that are sometimes, like we talk about sea blindness in the maritime space being invisible, but sometimes the people that are traversing the maritime space can be invisible as well. Yeah, so there's Sal's channel, What's Going On with Shipping. Down below, Maritime Executive, and then G Captain, fantastic. All of those are must subscribe news lists. And then talked about Outlaw Ocean and following Ian Urbina in that project. SimSec, incredible. If you're already interested in this space, no doubt you're familiar with SimSec and their two podcasts, Bilge Pumps and Sea Control. And then lastly, our friends over at the Maritime Coin Project at Proceedings, Hunter Stiers and his team doing really great work. And then over at Stanford, Sea Light came out of the Gordian Knot Center, and they're doing a lot of work on aggressive transparency and showing malign activity in the South China Sea. So I'm following their project with great interest as well. Global Fishing Watch, another one, surely you've heard of if you're interested in this space, and especially the way they're using technology, emerging technologies. And if Umar is still on the call, I would like to just let him share a little bit about AIS and his project for about 30 seconds just to wrap it up, because he's doing incredible work. Umar's brilliant, and he's a sophomore at Georgetown, and kind of cold called to get involved in the project, which was super encouraging, and I love the initiative, and he's been a great team member. So Umar, can you just share a little bit about the piece that you have coming out soon?
Sure. Lisa, first of all, thank you for the invite. Also, sorry if there's any background noise. As Lisa mentioned, I am a sophomore at Georgetown studying international security. And I'm currently working on a piece about the risks of AI spoofing. Obviously, as you and Sal highlighted, it's obviously very prescient for IUU fishing, but also being increasingly manipulated for great power competition, both in terms of subverting international law, entering EEZs, overfishing, and oil smuggling, but also crucially, it's being increasingly weaponized as a tool to make it appear that ships are where they shouldn't be, and as a potential casus belli. And that should be an article coming out through IWI soon. So look forward to that.
Thanks, Umar. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
So Dr. Macagliano, Lisa, and Umar as well, thank you very much for your time and your insight today. Thank you to all the folks who joined us in the chat. That's all we have for today. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.